hear me roar. Anyway, enough of that. So now that I do have your attention, oh God, you're filming this. Okay. Um, to begin, first of all, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and directly adjacent to the Haldeman Treaty Territory. And now I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of the Useful Knowledge Society. So the Useful Knowledge Society is basically myself, Maureen Wilson, Donna Reed, who unfortunately is sick and can't join us tonight, and Ryan McGreal. And we began about a year and a half ago. We actually, probably Maureen Wilson's brainchild. We were inspired by Benjamin Franklin, who brought the spirit of the Enlightenment from Europe back to North America. His desire was to improve the lot of the citizens of the U.S. at the time through the spirit of collaborative inquiry, by gathering together, sharing knowledge, and with the belief that the value of knowledge is directly related to its usefulness. And so we decided that we looked around at our city and we saw issues and wanted to look for solutions in the same spirit of collaborative inquiry, sharing knowledge among citizens to help us learn and to help us to find practical solutions to the problems we see around us. And so, since then, we've done events like this where we bring together people from different fields, different walks of life to share their knowledge so that we can take that knowledge away and apply it, hopefully in practical ways, and work to make our city a better place. We believe that having knowledge empowers us as citizens. But, the last few days I've been thinking about something else that knowledge gives us. And I think it's something that's really important in the world right now in a global sense, and I think also in our city. It gives us empathy and compassion. I think when we listen to other people, when we share perspectives, it's learn about other people's experience. It creates a feeling of empathy, and something on a city level, something that I've discovered by through things like political campaigns where I just find the more you talk to people from different parts of the city, the more you find we share. And so I think the more knowledge empowers us, but also gives us compassion, empathy. So I'm sorry about the sound. I don't know, is that me? Am I standing too close? Or? Okay. All right. Okay. So, without further ado, there is more ado, because I have a couple of people I would like to introduce. First of all, our host and moderator for this evening, Stephanie Ross. There is Stephanie. So Stephanie will be leading things off. She's an associate professor of labor studies at McMaster University. Her work concentrates on social change through collective action. She focuses on public sector workers, unions, and the role they play in defending public services. she's edited 2 books, Rethinking the Politics of Labor in Canada and Public Sector Unions in the Age of Austerity. And she's also the president of the Canadian Association for Work and Labor Studies and a member of the board of the Workers' Arts and Heritage Centre. So we're thrilled to have Stephanie with us tonight. And I would also be remiss if I did not mention Alex Zafer, the photographer whose work you've been enjoying this evening. So, Alex, I'm sorry. I had a little bio all written out for you, and I've lost my notes. So, but Alex is a photographer and a digital media producer. He's in all different kinds of media, and worked on documentaries, photographic exhibits all over the world, in Canada, US, and Europe and Japan. He has a fascinating website, The Candid Flaneur. I meant to tell you to bring business cards, but anyway, go talk to Alex on the break. The Candid Flaneur, Flaneur, if you're looking it up, where he celebrates street photography. And we were really taken with Alex's work, his unique perspective, but also just the sensitivity and compassion he shows towards his subjects. And we thought his work would bring a real richness to some of the subjects we'll be discussing tonight. So when we asked him to participate, we were really honored when he said yes, and we're just thrilled that he's able to bring a visual and emotional and artistic component to discussions we'll have tonight. I think that's adding a tremendous amount. So thank you very much. And now, without further ado, Stephanie Ross. More ado? Oh, I forgot. Oh my God. Oh, sorry, I even had a visual cue. So, for those of you who are here last time may remember the hat. So, we obviously, as you know, we do not charge for these events, but the venue costs money, mics and sound systems cost money, and if you are able, if you can throw a little bit in the hat and help us continue doing these sorts of things, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mary Louise. Thanks, Maureen, Donna, and Ryan. Just to start by saying what an incredible thing the Useful Knowledge Society is, and what those, in particular, those 4 individuals do for our city. They're really tireless in raising and framing the issues that we confront today as a city. And every morning I wake up and I read their words on various social media, and I'm very grateful. I feel like they're speaking for me. And I'm so grateful that they take the time to do that and to give us some anchor in thinking through the challenges that we face together as a city. So, as Mary Louise said, I'm going to be the moderator for tonight's proceedings. I know that I'm going to learn a lot from the people that we have gathered here tonight. We have, over the course of the evening, 7 women who are, I think, going to bring some amazing experience and knowledge about the question of what does the city mean for women? How do women move through the city? What kind of cities make it possible for women to belong, to reach their aspirations, to be included, to have power, to have autonomy? But I look around and I see a lot of people that I know, other women in the city who also are incredibly knowledgeable and active on these issues. And so I know that we're actually going to have an excellent exchange tonight. We're going to have some folks up at the front talking in the first part of the evening, but it's really important to us that you feel that you can ask questions and make comments and bring your experiences and concerns to bear on the discussion tonight. So there's 2 things. One is that there's a piece of paper on the wall, and when we have an intermission in about 20 minutes or so time, there's markers there and that ask you to go and write some of your thoughts, if you have thoughts about what it is that you've heard that's really important to you, or what it is that's been missed. And you can do that while you're lining up to get a drink at the intermission, or at the end while we're kind of milling about and leaving. And I think the interest is for us to be able to capture in some way the thoughts and the responses of people here gathered who were not, at least this time, asked to speak from the front, but who knows, in the future you may be here on the panel as well. We know as Hamiltonians that our city is on the cusp of some incredible transformations. But as with everything, we are faced with some key burning questions. Who is the city for? Whose lives are imagined when we build or change our cities? Whose needs? Whose working lives? Whose families? Whose ease? Whose safety? Who will thrive in the city as it changes, and who will be left behind? Those are concerns that thread through all of the debates and conversations that we're having in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, but they are at the core of the debates that we have about the city, even when we think the city isn't changing. Tonight, we're gathered here to talk about these questions from a particular lens. We want to put a gendered lens as we grapple with these questions. And so to do this, it gives me great pleasure to welcome one of Canada's leading feminist geographers as our guest speaker, Linda Peake. Linda is a professor at York University's Urban Studies program, and there she is the director of the City Institute. I was lucky enough to be a colleague with her for about 10 years before I came to McMaster. She earned her PhD in geography at Reading University, and she has taught at universities in the UK, the US, Guyana, and Canada. Her research interests focus on issues of feminist geographies of gender, race, and sexuality, particularly as they pertain to the urban global South. Additionally, Linda has a long-standing interest in urban-based research on women in cities, on whiteness, and on developing anti-racist practices in geography. And again, as a colleague, I can say that when I was at York, Linda was one of the most significant and principled feminist mentors in that institution, whose leadership has been very important for junior women scholars, and so I'm very grateful for that role she plays there. So, without further ado, join me in welcoming Linda Peake.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Stephanie for those very kind words, and Maureen for inviting me. And can I say how wonderful it is to be talking about issues around urbanization in the city and have an audience largely comprising women. Because when you work in the world of academia or policy or planning and you talk about urban issues, you can guarantee that the room's largely going to be filled with men. And that's something that I'm been working to change. So what I want to do tonight is very briefly just start by saying what are some of the issues that relate to women in cities and what does this mean in terms of city building. And I'm going to start by saying something about urbanization and then go on to discuss how women's experience of the city can differ from those of men, and go on to discuss what a charter that addresses women's right to the city would look like. So let me start by asking, why is there so much interest in this current juncture about women and cities and urbanization? And I think the reason is that we live in what's been referred to in many UN documents and World Bank documents as what's referred to as the 21st century of the city. Our past might have been rural, but our present and our future is very definitely urban. And urbanization is in fact one of the most important and complex challenges that we face in the 21st century. It's There's a very large-scale movement of people into urban areas throughout the globe, and it's really unprecedented. There's an estimate that something like 1 million people a week are moving into areas that we designate as urban. Although I do want people to take, that term urban with a pinch of salt, because there's no global definition of what constitutes the urban. It varies tremendously from nation to nation. But on a global scale, the tipping point into this so-called 21st century of the city was reached just 8 years ago, 2008, when 50% of the world's population was designated as living in areas defined as urban. Of course, in Canada, it happened quite a bit earlier in the early 1980s. So urbanization is growing both by natural increase as well, but also by extremely high rates of rural to urban migration. And it's estimated that by 2050, something like 2/3 of the world's population will be living in urban areas. But also, between the years 2000 and 2050, about 90% of the growth in urban areas is going to be in the global south, in Asia and Africa alone. So what does that mean? It means that in many countries, in many places in the global north, we have not so much urban growth, but urban decline. And in fact, StatsCan has estimated that 1 in 4 Canadian cities over the last 5 years have lost population. But Canada is an urban country. Over 80% of the population lives in urban areas. And I don't have to tell you, of course, that Hamilton is a medium-sized urban area. I think it's ranked as the 9th largest in the country, with a population of just under 700,000. And Hamilton, of course, as I'm sure you all know, is also part of the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And this is an area, of course, with one of the largest population concentrations in North America. So Hamilton is growing, and growth in Hamilton is being fueled by people relocating from the GTA and from immigration. And in fact, Hamilton has become a major destination for immigrants. In the 2006 census, over 20% of people in Hamilton were born outside Canada. And that's the 3rd highest foreign-born population proportion in the country after Toronto and Vancouver. So, levels of urbanization are increasing, certainly globally, certainly in this part of Canada, the Golden Horseshoe, and more policymakers and academics are turning their attention to the city. And so is capital. Big capital is turning its attention to the city as well. But many academics and policymakers seem to assume that urbanization benefits women, that urbanization benefits all women. And I want to say that despite the opportunities that urbanization presents to women, women also face disenfranchisement, disadvantage, and discrimination. So in the 21st century alone, we know that urban growth has been marked by inequality. Inequality is not new, of course, but there are certain characteristics which distinguish inequality in the 21st century. We've also had, in just the first decade of the 20th century, the urbanization of poverty on a global scale. And increasingly what we're now seeing is the feminization of that urban poverty as well, globally. And this is why I think we need to look at what are the specific needs of women in urban areas and take a gendered look at life in the city. So let me turn to this notion then of adopting a gendered lens, or I'd rather say a feminist approach to looking at women's lives in the city. Because regardless of city size or geographic location, women's and men's experience of the urban are played out through gendered norms and expectations, and thus they're often different. And this is primarily, of course, because women and men have different responsibilities for production and social reproduction. And what I mean by those phrases is that women and men have different responsibilities for waged and unwaged work that results in a gendered division of labor in the workplace, in the home, and in the community. And it's not a division of labour that shifted a great deal over the past 50 years or so. Even as more and more women have moved into waged work, there has been less engagement, less change in terms of men taking on domestic responsibilities or responsibilities in the community. So there's a triple burden then that women face in relation to work: waged work, domestic work, and community-based work. So how do those gender differences between men and women play out in the city? First of all, in the ways in which women and men use and give meaning to urban space. So in many cities, men have more access to public space. You're more likely to see men and boys, for example, out on playing fields, playing sports, in outdoor cafes, sitting with other men, on certain streets at night, in certain public demonstrations. Women are more likely to be seen in public at the school gates, collecting their children from school, going shopping, deliberately avoiding certain places in the city. Secondly, there's a difference in the degree of restrictions that are placed on women's and men's mobilities and in levels of spatial exclusion. So in many cities, women are restricted from moving around as freely as men. Many women who suffer from domestic violence, one of the first things that can happen to them is the restrictions put on their mobility by their partners. But it's not just engagement in terms of domestic violence that restrict women's mobility. It's also, of course, that there are responsibilities for childcare and for elder care, which can restrict them to the home. Lower levels of car ownership for women than for men as well. And public transportation systems, which operate in many cities still as if they're geared towards the production needs of men, often traveling from the suburbs into the city centre, as opposed to the social reproduction needs of women, which are quite different in terms of public transit needs, going shopping, taking their kids off to daycare, going into wage work themselves, and so on. There's a third difference as well in terms of men's and women's access to basic needs and employment. There's still very much a gender gap here. Globally, women have much lower levels of employment than men. They're much more likely than men to be living in poverty. Women have lower incomes still, as we know, than men. Girls have less access to education. Women have less access to healthcare than men. There's also a difference in terms of men's and women's risk of encountering violence. The city can be a dangerous place for women. In fact, I would argue that we live in an epidemic of violence. Most violence against women takes place in the so-called private space of the home. But if gendered violence in the home is often hidden or rationalized as some kind of private matter, women are sometimes held responsible for their victimization in public spaces, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, wearing the wrong clothing, etc. And of course, I don't have to mention to anybody in this room about the disappearance of Indigenous women here in Canada. And it's not only geographies of fear that vary for different groups of women. Particular categories of women are much more vulnerable to xenophobia and violence. Race, ethnicity, religion, age, disability, sexuality, gender identification, and class are all factors that figure into relative risk around violence. And in very different ways, transgendered women experience on a day-to-day basis the violent policing of gender in such seemingly non-gendered public spaces such as airports, public transit, elevators, university classrooms. And rigidly gendered places, such as public toilets or bathrooms, can be dangerous and violent places for those who do not conform to a gender binary. There are also differences in women's and men's exposure to environmental hazards, largely due to women's increased engagement in social reproduction. So globally, women and girls are at higher risk of disadvantage due to climate change and exposure to environmental pollutants. there are also significant differences in women's and men's ownership of land and property. Women are much less likely to own land and housing. Properties are often registered in men's names, and in some places women are prevented from inheriting land and property. And finally, there are differences in terms of women's and men's civic disenfranchisement. So women are much less likely to be elected to public office in cities, although they're much more likely to be engaged in community-based mobilizations and activities at the neighborhood level. So that unpaid and volunteer work that takes place in communities, in particular in the most impoverished communities, is carried out by women. And increasingly so in these neoliberal times, when many of the responsibilities of the state have been downloaded either onto the private sector or onto individual households. And for those individual households, read women. So in short then, gender has a significant influence on women's place in the city in terms of women's life chances and well-being, as well as determining the sustainability of urban life. But women have the right to live in the city. And over the years, a number of attempts have been made by women, ranging through novelists to planners, to think about how we can plan cities differently to address the needs of women. And in particular, some groups of women have been interested in drawing up charters to address women's needs. The first of these charters came in 1995, the European Charter of Women in the City. There was also in, I think it was 2002, the Montreal Declaration on Women's Safety. And one of the most recent is in 2004, the International Charter for Women's Right to the City. And in England, there was a political party that set up the Women's Equality Party, which also developed its own charter for the city. For these charters to be employed, though, requires situating women at the heart of city planning and daily life, and of daily life being seen through a women's eye. And this is a political issue. Charters such as these will go nowhere without political will. But the charters are based on central aspects of what's called the right to the city, which is increasingly being recognized as a fundamental human right. And in fact, in October last year, Habitat 3 set up a global platform for urbanisation, which was based not on housing. Habitat 1 and Habitat 2 were primarily concerned with housing. Habitat 3 has changed its mantra to the right to the city. And what that means is that women have the right not only to use city spaces, but also to participate in decision-making about the city. So if you look at all of these charters, there tends to be 6 areas in which they're in agreement that need to be addressed in relation to women's needs. Engagement in the democratic management of cities, looking at issues of safety and security in cities, access to public services and employment, access to secure housing, tenure, issues around mobility, and lastly, environmental issues. Do I have time? Oh, okay. And we will be discussing all of these issues in some detail in the discussion period. Let me just say a quick word about each of these. Women, of course, have the right to participate at all levels in decision-making processes around democratic management of cities, but as we know, there aren't enough women engaged in urban planning. There aren't enough women engaged at the level of being city councillors. There aren't aren't enough women trained either in economics in relation to issues around public investments and expenditure. So these are all areas in which we need to expand, not just the number of women, but the number of feminists going into those fields. Secondly, in terms of security conditions in the city, insecurity and violence are, of course, two of the most serious problems of our cities, because violence, or the threat of violence, restricts access and use and appropriation of the city by its citizens, and in particular by women. In terms of access to public services and employment, women are the primary users of urban services and facilities. Here in Hamilton, 60% of the people who use public transit are women. Right? But many planners don't think about the location of housing and employment and urban activities in relation to each other. One thing that feminist planners have been arguing for is the use of mixed use neighborhoods in relation to public services. In terms of housing tenure, although in the majority of countries now, legal frameworks do recognize women's right to property and inheritance, in many places, cultural mechanisms and practices persist that limit the effective application of those laws. And even here in Canada, just in terms of meeting eligibility criteria for subsidized or so-called affordable housing, such programs ensure that you've got a regular income, that you've got formal employment. And for many women, their income comes from informal and unstable jobs, and increasingly, from zero-hour contracts and even less than the minimum wage. In terms of mobility, I've already mentioned that women's movement around the city is different from men. It's predicated on activities of social reproduction as well as production, and it's largely engaged in relation to public transit and not so much by private transportation. And finally, in relation to the environment risks to health and to life, in fact, are very much related to environmental pollution and to climate change, and there's a disproportionate effect of climate change and environmental pollutants on the life of women and children because of their differential exposure to these risks, largely through, again, the tasks that they carry out in relation to their social reproduction activities. I'm going to leave it at that then, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Linda. And let me just say what an incredibly disciplined academic she is. We're not known for our brevity or our willingness to stop talking. So well done. Okay, so I know that you're probably burning with questions, but we're going to let you have an intermission. So have an opportunity to chit-chat with each other about some of the things that Linda has said. We're going to have 15 minutes. 10 minutes. Oh, I'm being told 10 minutes. So we'll have a 10-minute break. We'll assemble our panelists, and you can have an opportunity to go to the bar and maybe write some thoughts on our chart in the back. And so when I come back here and I yell and scream, you'll pay attention, right? Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks very much to Linda for that very stimulating talk that really put a lot of the issues that we face here in Hamilton into a global perspective, which I think is really important for us to keep in mind. That our experiences are distinct, but also that we share a lot of common issues across the globe. And that we can learn from other places, other women activists, how they are taking the city into their own hands. So thank you very much. We now have a very illustrious panel here assembled in front of you. So these are women from the community, from this community, and who are going to be joined also by a guest from Toronto, and to speak about the issues that Linda raised. So these panelists were given the task of speaking to us briefly about what the theme of women in the city meant to them from their vantage point, from their work, their experience in the city, their experience of activism or advocacy. And so they are going to have between 5 to 7 minutes each. Of course, it's not enough, but I imagine you want to get home before midnight. So I'll try to be kind but fair in the keeping of the time, but let me introduce them to you. So beginning on the far right is Lindsay Goddard, who is a transit user. Awesome, that's a good thing, the first thing in one's bio, I love that. A member of the volunteer-run Hamilton for Transit Advocacy Group, and has been involved in a number of other local advocacy campaigns, about which I'm sure she'll speak. Next, closest to me on the panel is Catherine Kalinowski, who's the Assistant Executive Director of Programs at Good Shepherd here in Hamilton. In this capacity, she's responsible for a broad range of services, including emergency shelters for women, youth, families, and men, housing first and shelter diversion programs, a mental health crisis center, hospice, a portfolio of 500 plus units of affordable and supportive housing. So it's amazing that she was able to make time to be here with us tonight. She is the chair and founding member of the Women's Housing Planning Collaborative, and has been recognized for her work in the community, receiving a YWCA Women of Distinction Award in 2013, and she was inducted in the Hamilton Gallery of Distinction in 2014. So, next to Catherine is Nazia Zeb, who's a community developer with the Social Planning and Research Council of Hamilton. Nazia has some fans in the crowd, I hear. Well-deserved, I'm sure. She has served the Hamilton community for over 12 years, holding various roles in social services, including immigrant settlement services. In all of her roles, she has been committed to social justice, inclusion, and gender equity. She, along with her family, immigrated to Canada from North Pakistan in 2002. Next will be Susan Barberstock, who's sitting right in the middle there. Susan is the Executive Director of the Hamilton Regional Indian Center. She's an Aboriginal woman from the Tyendinaga Mohawk territory and has worked with the urban Aboriginal population for the last 20 years. Her experience, combined with her education, which is a Bachelor of Social Work from Ryerson University, has assisted her in a career path that started with the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres, where she held various management positions, and with the Healing and Wellness Program and the Justice Initiatives Program. And then last but not least on the panel is Sonia McDonald, who is the co-founder and principal at Civic Plan. She has over 15 years of experience in community development. She designs and manages participatory budgeting campaigns, neighborhood renewal strategies, and organizational evaluations. Sonia's work combines strategic planning, public engagement, and civic analytics to inform more effective decision-making and to build stronger communities. She has a master's in communication and is a member of the Canadian Communications Association, as well as the International Association for Media and Communication Research. A very distinguished panel, I must say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the panel speak, and then at the end, I'll introduce our final speaker of the evening, who is Sevon Palvetsian. But Sevon, we've given her the task of summing up all of the discussion, so I'll take the opportunity to introduce her at that time, okay? All right, take it away, Lindsay.
Okay, so I'm here on the panel. I'm not a distinguished member of the panel, but I'm here representing the community. I'm on the panel as a woman who uses transit and active transportation as my primary means of transportation. My household doesn't have a car. And like many people who I recognize in the room right now, I've been one of the people who have been very involved recently in advocating for better public transit in Hamilton. As most of you are probably aware, we've really been on a roller coaster when it comes to that over the last several months. The good news, of course, is that the LRT is going ahead for now, and thanks. And I think this is actually what we should really applaud for. I think the LRT is going ahead after, I would say, an unprecedented grassroots mobilization of community members in Hamilton to make this happen. So we've passed the serious milestone when the council approved the environmental assessment, and now after years and years with no significant transit resources, new resources put into transit in the city, we really have a once-in-a-lifetime, I think, opportunity to piggyback off of this investment to build a sustainable and equitable transportation system, not just along the LRT line, and this is very important, but around the whole network in Hamilton, the proposed BLAST network. And I think that's what's going to be very important, because I really wanted the LRT to happen, a lot of activists, but it is possible, you know, that if we build the LRT like we've been building the HSR, working on the HSR, we could really lose the opportunity to improve transit for everyone and make a more sustainable and equitable society. You know, it could intensify existing problems. So those of you in the room who have been kind of standing down and saying, all right, the fight is over, it's not. So this is the call to action. I think we've got to get ready for the next battle, which is to make sure that we, members of the community, are making sure that it's done right. And I think as Dr. Peak has just laid out for us, and as Maureen has been doing on the Useful Knowledge Facebook page for anyone who's been monitoring that, we can really see that we can't build a system, like a transit system, or I think any urban system, to benefit everyone unless we incorporate a gender-based perspective. So I think the bad news is, in Hamilton, is that this is not a lens that I think has ever been applied to the public transportation system that we have. My perspective is going to be a very hyper-local perspective, so I'm hoping that people in the audience who are involved in transit will use this. It's going to be very specific. But we're talking about, Dr. Peak was talking about how women use transit very differently than men do. And we can see that it's obvious that from her talk that depending on your age, your gender, your health, you're going to use the transit system differently. And the problem is that I know that in the city right now, we don't have any of that information about who's using our transit system. As I was quite surprised to learn with my colleagues when we started getting involved in transit activism a few years ago, there is virtually no information available on the profile of transit users. You know, for any other service, I don't know, you would assume that you would know who's using it, their demographics. None of that information exists. And I think, you know, maybe very irregularly there's been surveys, but there's no regular way to find out who it is that's using this system. And you can track numbers, I think, of users through things like the fare box to a certain degree, but it's very inaccurate. So in Hamilton, if you're using a monthly pass, or you're not tracked at all. You buy the pass, they don't know where you're going. If you're using one of the student passes, this is the case. And if we reflect on what Dr. Peak has been talked about, I think, and what I've heard elsewhere, is that so we hear that women have more responsibility, even with their paid work, for childcare and for elder care in the community. So their trips, they've heard the term trip chaining. Women are much more likely to trip chain than men. So if you're a man, maybe you get on the bus, you go to work, turn around and come home. If you're a woman, you're making a stop at daycare on the way home, or you're stopping to get groceries. And maybe you're doing this on off-peak hours, or you're coming with an elderly family member. So this type of traffic, and it's a lot of it, you've paid your fare once and then you're traveling on a transfer, it's not being tracked in any way. So sorry, 2 minutes, yeah. So this information is going to be getting, I think the first step in a gender-based lens is going to be, we need to find out how it is that women are using transit in the city, because we don't know right now. And the second point I think that I would make about this is that, and this, we've also had this discussion on Facebook, is that women are kind of the super users of transit as well. So not only is our HSR not collecting information from women, but there's all this information on how maybe stops that are a problem, buses that tend to run late. You know, that if women had the opportunity to give this information, if someone was collecting it, then we could build a good transit system. So the hope that I really have is now that we've had this big investment with LRT, that we as a community who have mobilized can continue to mobilize and make sure that, you know, that nobody's left behind with this investment and that we can make it work for all the transit users. Okay, thanks.
So, I'm supposed to talk about housing tonight, but I think I'm going to start a bit earlier than that, because I think what's interesting about this conversation is what happens when you don't use a gender lens. And housing and homelessness is a great example of what can happen. So in 1995, I was 4 years old and started my career at Good Shepherd. I was working in a violence against women shelter, and one of the things I realized was that there was, and I wasn't the first to realize, that there was a real disconnect, that there were no shelter beds for homeless women in Hamilton, and so homeless women, often women who were quite street involved, were struggling with substance use and serious mental illness and other issues, would sometimes find space in the violence against women shelters, and they were often treated as pariahs in those settings. Women and children who had fled traumatic abuse situations were a little freaked out with the woman with the serious mental health issue and vice versa. It wasn't a good idea. And we looked around the community and realized we had 150 plus emergency shelter beds for men and 0 for women. Interesting. So after a big community effort, and it was a collaborative effort, we opened 9 beds for women. And that was seen as a real earth-shaking moment, and it was amazing because I had the pleasure of opening that program and sitting and waiting for the first 2 weeks for the first woman to arrive. And arrive she did, and arrived, and arrived, and arrived. Fast forward even 5 years ago, and we still had a similar number of emergency shelter beds for men in this community, and now we were up to 20 beds for women. And we were turning women away and continue to turn women away from emergency shelter in this community between 100 and 300 to 400 times a month at the shelter that I'm responsible for alone. And this is replicated in shelters across the city. So I would start by saying that if you take a historical perspective, what you'll find is that the failure to use a gender lens or even consider the needs of women in developing public policy and executing it actually results in, well, the average age of death for a Canadian woman is 81 years and it's 39 years for a homeless woman. So it actually results in death. That's what I would say. I think that you can gauge the health and resiliency of a community by considering the situation of the people who have the least power, the least resources, and see how they're faring. And the fact is that women in our community are really struggling, especially around housing and homelessness. We have a bottleneck in our system where we're turning women away, where women are in shelter because they've fled a violent situation in their home, sometimes with children, sometimes without, or they've had a series of circumstances that have resulted in homelessness. And if they're lucky enough to get a shelter bed, they aren't necessarily lucky enough to find housing that they can safely move into in the community. It's not affordable, it's not safe, it's not sustainable, and we see a cycle happen over and over again. So we have about 35,000 women on any given night in Canada who are absolutely homeless. We have about 7,000 women, thank you Sarah Mayo for this information, 7,000 women in Hamilton, women and children who are at risk of homelessness because of their economic precarity, and about 3,000 women estimated on any given night in Hamilton who are amongst the hidden homeless. That says that we don't need to build more shelters, actually. What it says is that we need adequate housing, and we need housing that addresses the specific needs of women. And the way that we would develop that housing would be to ask women what they need and want, I would suggest might be a good place to start. But it's not something that we often do, although there are people in this room who do ask those questions and respond to them in really creative ways. So I will just give voice to things that women have told me over the last 25 years about what they want. They worry about gentrification. They don't call it that necessarily, but they worry about being displaced from the neighborhoods that they've circulated in and lived in for many years. They worry about being disconnected from the natural supports that they've developed that have helped them to survive and subsist in our community. Younger women worry about being pushed out into the suburbs or out of the neighborhoods they're used to and not being able to navigate to jobs, to daycare, to a grocery store, because they can no longer afford to live in the neighborhoods in Hamilton that they have lived in previously. Women also worry a lot about safety. Having good information and good supports in the housing they're in, because they're often at risk from other tenants or from unscrupulous landlords, and there are some wonderful landlords out there that we work with who make really great and safe and responsive places for women to live available. But women don't feel like they have the kinds of supports they need necessarily they have to stay in unsafe situations because there aren't other options. They can't afford to move, and it's not safe to stay where they are. They're between a rock and a hard place. Women also talk about wanting a place where they can age in place, and this is really important for women. A place where women in social housing, for example, who are concerned about being overhoused because their children have grown and have moved, and now they're being told that they have too much housing, and they're going to be dislocated from the neighborhood and the housing situation they've been in for years, and moved into a place where they're afraid they won't be able to have their grandchildren visit, or a friend to visit, or an older child who maybe has a bit of a crisis and needs to come home, a place for them to be. So these are things that women really worry about. We need more transitional housing. Women talk about needing a place, moving from absolute homelessness and getting settled in the community. They need a place to stop and rest. Very difficult in a funding environment that says transitional housing is... The feds heard me. An environment where funders say that transitional housing is not necessarily a priority at this point in time. We need housing with support. People need different levels of support over time, and if they have it, they can sustain their housing and they can continue to be productive and engaged members of our community, which predicts a healthier and more resilient community for all of us. So investment in supports is tremendously important. Finally, women want to talk about alternative kinds of housing models. They want community. They want to look at new ways, especially older women are talking about new ways to gather together and support each other and build a different kind of inclusive and equitable community where their voices are heard. So those are the things that I've heard from women about housing. None of them seem that radical, or at the end of the day, the investment in them seems to pay high dividends in terms of lowered healthcare costs and all the things that people here probably know about. But we need to include women's voices in those discussions, obviously in terms of elected representation, positions in local bureaucracy, all levels of bureaucracy, and also finding ways to include women more assertively in community conversations. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm honored to be sharing with you my thoughts on women and the city. I believe it is important to analyze certain situations from a gendered lens. However, it is equally important to further challenge ourselves and use the race lens so we can fully understand the marginalization and struggle of racialized women. We live in an era when women have achieved equality in some areas. However, I ask you to ask yourself, is it the same for racialized women? Ask yourself, who are the policy and decision makers in our city building? Ask yourself, have I used my privilege to make racialized women feel more included, as sometimes that's all what they might need? Ask yourself, Have I truly believed in and considered the knowledge of racialized women as legitimate and worthy? Ask yourself, have I done anything that has resulted in making the lives of racialized women a little less challenging? I believe our womanhood bring us together, but our race, although socially constructed, take us apart. My comments and observations are based on my personal, educational, and professional experiences navigating complex systems and structures within our city. How my education and experience are acknowledged or not acknowledged, both at micro and macro level, are greatly influenced by the skin I'm in and the accent I have. The multiple intersecting identities of racialized women result in how they are viewed by the dominant group. Imagine, people think that you got your job not because you are qualified for it, but because you checked that box, referring to employment equity. Imagine, you hope and pray that the interviewer will look past through your name and your accent and won't shut the door on you because you don't fit the frame. Imagine, you always have to prove yourself before you will be taken seriously in any space in our city. Imagine, you are watching your child playing soccer at a city-owned public space. Your child collides with another child and they both fall on ground. The father of that other child, a white man, yells, "Watch your wallet." And all other parents laugh. How do you save in that place? That is a public space. I guess it depends how we define a public space. Even imagining all these may give you burning and sinking feelings. These are not my imagination, but a glimpse of my lived experience being a racialized woman, as a label I dislike very much but can't escape. Losing my class privilege and experience of juggling between multiple intersecting identities post-immigration has sensitized me to the needs of underprivileged groups. These experiences have taught me that our societies are structured in a way that serve purpose to some at the cost of others. I believe that race has a role in how racialized bodies are marginalized and pushed out from public spaces. I believe that race needs to become a focal point in policies, programs, and actions so we could fully understand the role of race in our day-to-day interactions with racialized bodies. In closing, I like to say that this city provided countless opportunities for me as a racialized woman. However, there are countless women who are denied opportunities. Together, we can create equitable and welcoming spaces for all. So let's set a higher standard of accountability for each other. And promise that we will not accept anything but inclusion for all. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to say, when you talked about all of the statistics and those types of things, that when you add that Indigenous piece in there, that you're looking at things 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 and 6 times higher, how it impacts on the Indigenous population. And when I was talking with Maureen and she was talking about the Useful Knowledge Society, what came to my mind is it's not just about the useful knowledge that we have, we need to also check what our attitudes and our values and what skills do we bring to the table. And I always talk about that, to work as a team and to create change. It's about the knowledge that we have, the skills that we bring, and understanding each other's attitudes and values, because whether they're good or bad, it helps you to create a relationship, and this is what it's about. It's about, when we're looking at creating change, it's about creating relationships, fostering those relationships. We're talking about infrastructure and women and how we get around, and I think when you look at, again, the Indigenous women, we're overrepresented, and yet we don't have that voice, and we're not sitting at those tables. And if we are sitting at those tables, are we just sitting there so that, government officials and whomever can tick the box that there's somebody sitting at the table? So it's about giving voice, letting and hearing that voice, because sometimes when we're given the opportunity to speak, it falls on deaf ears, and then they, again, tick the box that we listen to the Aboriginal community, and where do we go and what do we do? When we look at, the study that came out today through Stats Canada, looking at Aboriginal women in Canada are 2.7 times more likely to face violence than non-Aboriginal women. And, having the conversation with my daughter about some of these things, and she says, why do we have to be so afraid for our safety, and why can't we change those behaviors? Right, so we're always thinking about our safety, and you think back to when we were younger, just last year, no. When we were younger and we were children, like there wasn't those big concerns about our safety, and we could play in the parks, and we could stay out after the street lights came on, and those types of things. So I think we need to really check some of those attitudes and behaviors of some of our younger people and some of our men, and get back to some of those, no matter which culture you're from, but getting back to some of those roles and responsibilities, because we all have those roles and responsibilities, whether you're a man or a woman. And how do you fit into the society? Looking at the Indigenous women in the roles that we play, myself being a Mohawk woman, and the roles that are expected of us, and the responsibility that I carry as an Mohawk Aboriginal woman is that voice. And some people say, oh, here comes a Mohawk woman, be very careful of your words because she'll correct you. I don't do that. Well, I might, but I'll do it in a good way. And that's what it's about, right? When you're creating these relationships, it's about doing things in a good way. And when you do things in a good way, then you're going to change those behaviors. And so I think, we've all talked about different things here, and I wanted to focus on those behaviors. And I want to focus on when we're doing things, it's about doing things holistically, right? So when we look at things holistically and we're working with individuals holistically, it's about the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of that individual, and how do we work in each of those 4 quadrants to make sure that there's balance there. So if we have to look after our physical needs, right, can we do it safely? We have to look after our mental needs. How do we do that? How do we access those services? Our emotional needs, how do we access those? And to be able to access our culture, that's hard, and it's hard in this day and age because of transportation, because of different things. We're not living in our home communities, so we can't get home to access our services. So how do we do that? And it's about creating culturally safe spaces so that I can practice my culture and my tradition. And that's huge. I always say that we've moved beyond that cultural competency or cultural awareness, and we've moved into being culturally competent so that we're creating culturally safe spaces. And when we look at the Truth and Reconciliation report and the 94 calls to action, one of those calls to action will impact on you in some way. And so I think you need to look at what's contained in the TRC report, and how do those calls to action affect me, and what do I need to do? You all have a job here, and you are all involved in an organization within the city of Hamilton. What are you taking back to your organization? Because it has to start somewhere. It has to be one individual who's going to get on their soapbox and who's going to carry that torch and to do something. And it's about educating yourself, because knowledge is power. And I think, being one of the Indigenous women in the community, you have to involve the Indigenous people, no matter who they are, where they sit, with those lived experiences. How are they involved in the community? Because they have a voice. And it's not just about being lumped in with everybody else. It needs to be a separate piece for the Indigenous population. And when you're seeing all of these things on social media and in the news now about Canada 150, and how is the Indigenous population fitting into that? And it's like, we're not. We've been here longer than 150 years. We have many different things, and have some fun celebrating the 150, but don't forget to recognize that Indigenous population, and we've been here much longer than that. as I said, as an individual, we grow. A lot of times when we're doing the cultural competency training, it's about, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted. And so it's, again, if we're going to change behaviors and you're going to be doing these cultural competency training, it has to be mandatory. It cannot be, if you want to attend, it's going to happen on this day. And I think that, starting with the city, we've done a lot of work with the city, and how do we recognize some of those things. The land acknowledgement at the beginning is wonderful, but you have to understand what that land acknowledgement means. We add in about the treaty or the territory about the dish with one spoon. So what's the story behind the dish with one spoon? And I think that'll take me longer than 7 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever I have left. But when we also talk about the two-row wampum, right? And the two-row wampum talks about, and sorry, I don't have a visual, but what it talks about is those two paths, right? Those two streams, or those two boats that are traveling down that water. And I'm going to travel in my canoe, and you're going to travel in your boat. And we're not going to try and steer each other's ship, but we're going to work with each other about traveling that path down the water. And so I think that's a big part of infrastructure and everything else. How are we going to set in each in our own boats, and how we're going to, you're going to come over and see what I'm doing, and I'm going to go over and see what you're doing, but at no point am I going to try and steer your ship, and at no point should you try and steer my ship. And there's 3 rows between those, and it talks about the kindness, right? And that peace and that power and that righteousness, and how do we work together, and what do we need to do. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, going last. Yes, okay. Again, my name's Sonia McDonald, and I'm from an organization called Civic Plan, and our focus is on community planning and public engagement. And when I talked to Maureen about this, she said it'd be really good to have someone who's a bit more of a generalist to talk about things. So I'm very happy to feel like the generalist here. But for me, when I started thinking about the 3 themes that she highlighted around affordable housing, public transit, and public space in the context of women in the city, I kept coming back. I kept trying to think of links and there are many. But the one that really struck to me was really about urban space, because that's what I'm interested in, and that's what I work on, and that's really a lot of my experience. And I think that all of the experiences that you've heard here tie in very much into the ideas of public space. Public space should, and really should, be considered very broadly. It's everything from, in a physical context, it's everything from our sidewalks to our roads, to our parks, schools, libraries, to our public bathrooms, Maureen, and as well as to our public transit system. And our public transit system in the context is a public space. Even if you only think about it as a public space in that it uses our public laneways or roadways, and as well, that it is a public space for all of us to use. From my work experience, I think that when I look at public space and I look at women in the city, I look to certain examples, parks being one. And I think that one of the areas that I think is a great contrast of how it's done well and how it's not done well is you look at in downtown Hamilton. Some of you may not know that when you come to talk about employment in downtown Hamilton, the largest percentage of people who work in downtown Hamilton are women. 63% of the downtown working population of 25,000 or more are women. They tend to work in professional environments, so government jobs, in management jobs, in finance, education, and in the cultural sector. So they work in the core in our city down here. And if you think about why would that matter in terms of public space? Well, if you're going to spend most of your waking hours in the downtown in a work environment, it would be really nice to have space where you can go and walk and sit and convene and maybe breathe somewhat fresh air. In downtown Hamilton, in close proximity, we have 2 examples of public parks. We have one that most of you may not know about, which is at Jackson Square. And it's the raised urban park, which again was in the wonderful designs of the mid-20th century urban renewal projects, is a raised park on the top of Jackson Square Mall. and it's concrete with some green. It is not at street level. There are no eyes on the street, and there are a lot of nooks and crannies and ways around, and it's not safe for women. So it's not commonly used, and even when it is used, it's not necessarily used for activities that are safe in general at any time of the day. The other space that I think we could think about is Kitty Corner in Gore Park. Again, a Victorian park built at around the same time as the modern city was built. Gore Park for a long time had a certain perception and certain view. And about 4 or 5 years ago, all of a sudden the park became animated differently. And it became animated through in the summer months in particular, through the Gore Park Promenade. And during lunch hour, all of a sudden the park, there was entertainment. They closed off the southern side of the park, the road on the park, and it became active and engaged, people sitting around, using the space, eating, food trucks, music, the whole thing. And all of a sudden, you saw a whole group of folks who you'd never know were there, who worked in the buildings around or who lived in the neighborhood, who were coming out on a sunny day. Maybe not a day like today, but other sunny days. So all of a sudden you have a space that's animated and that's used. It's safe, it's open, there's places to convene, there's eyes on the street, and women can convene there safely. Therefore, it's an example of a space that is safe in many respects for everyone to use. I think when you're thinking also about connecting public space around transportation and alternative transportation in particular, and I mean, I think Lindsay's spoken very, very well about LRT, but you also have to look at something like Sobe Cycle, which has come to Hamilton in recent years. 50% or more of the users of Sobe Cycle, are women, and they come from different income brackets, and they use it predominantly for commuting and going to and from work, meetings, or school. You have an example there of an alternate means of transportation that women are adopting or embracing to get around the city as another means of mobility. You have another example of public space through public events, something like Supercrawl. Again, it's a free public party. September, it's huge. It's open to everybody to come. It's on the street level, street space. And you have the largest number of users or audience for Supercrawl consistently has been women year over year. And that's also because programming is directed across a gamut from family to, Fred Penner to the Strombellas is what I like to say. So you see a broad range of different interests that I can share the space, including public art and performance. Finally, I think the last issue around public space that I think is essentially important, and Linda Peake spoke about this, is the role of women in community work and community activism. We've had the opportunity to work over the last 6 or more years on participatory planning processes like participatory budgeting, both in Ward 1 and Ward 2. And one of the things that has come from that is that women don't just participate in these processes, they mobilize. And the way they mobilize is they mobilize most often around active concrete projects around public space. So we've seen women who have actively mobilized to put ideas forward, to generate support, to promote them, to get people out to vote, and to be successful on greening areas, on converting what was semi-private space at schools into public playgrounds, increasing safety and access to schools and to playgrounds and other things like this. And they've done this because they see the commitment, they see an avenue to engage city dollars through infrastructure investment to make their communities safer, but to also make better public space for themselves and for their community. So that's what I'd like to share about women in the city and how space is implicated in that. Thank you again very much to Useful Knowledge Society.
Everyone for those very rich contributions. So we're going to ask you to stay there because you are going to hopefully engage with your audience at some point. Finally, from the front here, please help me welcome Sivan Palvetsian, who is CEO at Civic Action in Toronto, and she's been in that position since January 2014. Under her leadership, the organization has launched the City Action Leadership Foundation and 2 new initiatives focused on youth unemployment and mental health in the workplace. Before Civic Action, Sivan held several senior roles within the Ontario government, where she developed the Youth and New Professional Secretariat, which was a government-wide strategy to attract and retain future generations of leaders, and many, many other important initiatives that are too lengthy to mention. We've asked Sivan to sort of play the role of summing up and bringing together some of the themes here, but in particular to talk a little bit about democratic engagement as at the core of how we are able to bring into being the kind of city that all of our panelists have talked about. So please welcome Sivan.
Thank you. I'm going to move this up a little bit. And what an amazing group of women. Can you hear me okay? What an amazing group of women to have the privilege to hear from and to be part of. So I thank you for both inviting me to be here tonight, but also for the privilege to join these incredible women as colleagues up here on the panel. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about women in the democratic process. And I'm going to share 3 ways that I think it's absolutely essential that we see more women actively engaged in that democratic process. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take it out. There we go. So I have 2 little girls. I wish I could have brought them tonight, but it's going to be way past their bedtime by the time I get back to Toronto tonight. But I actually started my career in Washington, D.C., and I love American politics, and my God, is it ever interesting to watch it right now. There's so much going on. But when I was having our first daughter, it was a very long labor. It was 52 hours to get that kid out, right? So I had them wheel in a TV because it was during the primaries of 2008, and it was between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and I couldn't get enough of it. And I thought, well, there's nothing else going on. I might as well watch what's going on in this primary. And so my first daughter was literally born during this interesting moment where a woman's name on a ballot was game-changing at that time. So fast forward, another little girl. And her labor thing, yeah, we learned the hard way, so she was induced. We just got that one right out. But she and her older sister have grown up in a home where we follow politics and where I wait with bated breath to see the day that there is a female leader of the free world. And we came so close, right? We got Merkel. But south of the border, we're not there yet. So this last election, right, Hillary's there, we're ready to go. And, every one of us, we stayed awake late trying to see what the results were going to be, and the kids fell asleep. And I actually fell asleep with one of the kids. And so she woke up early in the morning, and I'd watched CNN throughout the night, and then I couldn't believe the numbers. And she woke up the next morning, and she said, "Mama, is Hillary Clinton the President of the United States of America?" And I said, "No." And she said, "The very bad man won." And I'm nonpartisan, but yeah, I said the very bad man one. So the point of this story is to share with you that I have 2 young girls who are growing up and are growing up in a home with 2 parents who teach them about the value of politics and being engaged in a process. I hope that in their life we see more women add their names to ballots. Because frankly, that is still the best way to hold the pen as the sword. We have here in this city 5 of 14 councillors who are women. Toronto, which I call home, it's worse. And in the GTA, of some 30-some municipalities that are all wrapped in there, only 5 mayors are women. So until it is common that we see women from every order of government get their name on a ballot and add their name to the hallway where you get the office, then frankly, we're going to still be looking through lenses, and not the full big picture. So that's point 1. Point number 2, C-suite influencers. So the privilege of my role also affords me the opportunity to sit on many external task forces, advisory panels, and others. And so you get to see who is helping to shape government and business and some of these social issues. folks at the top of the masthead are not as representative of the populations that we actually serve. And the opportunity to get those C-suite influencers thinking more broadly about some of the topics and getting them out of the ivory towers, out of the Bay Street corner offices, and into the neighborhoods and the front lines of seeing this, I am convinced that anybody who walks through social housing to see the bed bugs, to smell the smells, to find the needles in the hallway. If you, honest to God, as an elected official or an influencer in any town, can walk through those buildings and not come out changed on the other end, if you can really do that, then you're not fit for office. The impact of experiences with influencers is absolutely key. Absolutely key. And I have benefited from it personally. I've seen it as part of a task force or group that's brought in to see something on the ground. And so the opportunity to make sure that the tables that influence the decision makers are themselves populated by a fair number of women that represent diverse voices and perspectives, but get them out of the tables and get them to the front lines. Make them ride the transit system and see how long it takes. 2.5 hours with 6 different changes to get from your job to Pearson Airport. Let them have that experience, because you don't carry a memory the same way unless you live it. Point number 3, around public engagement. So I did spend 10 years as a senior executive in the provincial government. It was wonderful. I learned a ton. And there's a thing called cabinet submission. That's the policy document that any government takes forward, whether it's environmental policy, whether it's social policy, and it's a template. And toward the back of that template is the stakeholder engagement section, right? And it is box checking at times. Now, good policymakers, the best policymakers, that's their favorite part, because they start the public engagement process long before the cabinet submission is due. They start the public engagement process when the idea is being conceived. Blue sky, not baked pie. Back on this end. The impact of policymakers. We spend a lot of time writing our petitions and knocking on the doors and having town hall meetings to have elected officials listen, and to have influencers, business leaders that get listened to, that sit on task forces, people that run businesses and enterprise. But policymakers are the Navy SEALs of social change. And because I spent 10 years in government working with policymakers, I got to see the power that they have. And you're nameless and faceless as a public servant. The only time as a public servant your name is ever in the media is if you blow a whistle, break a law, or earn 6 figures. Right? But the power that exists behind that anonymity is extraordinary. So how do you get those policymakers to have some different experiences and to really think about the value of lived experience of women of color, of newcomers, of women with disabilities? How do you get those guys? Well, sometimes you bring them out, but crap, there's 64,000 people who work for the Ontario government. We can't get everybody on bus tours, so you bring them in. And one of the things that I'm really proud of that we've done at Civic Action is we've started this annual policy session where we bring 200-300 policy leaders. We go to Queen's Park, and we had a panel of 3 women with lived experience of poverty. And I'm talking unbelievable poverty. And they're with an organization called Voices from the Street. Women speak out. And women and men, but in this case it was women, who have lived through the horrors of life, are coached through this program, Women Speak Out, on how to tell their story to decision makers. So we packed this auditorium full of policymakers, and we brought these women in to tell their stories. There wasn't a Harvard Business Review footnote. There wasn't an environmental scan of what other jurisdictions are doing. They were the raw, honest, earnest stories of 3 women. And the pens didn't stop moving the entire 2 hours. So the opportunity to think about engagement, the opportunity to think about public consultation, to turn it inside out, is an opportunity that is afforded to every single one of us. Now, I have the privilege, having worked in government and of serving in this civic role, to be able to serve as a plank. That's how I consider my role. I'm a plank. I have the privilege to get my foot in a couple of different worlds, and I love it when I have the opportunity to get a voice into someone else that maybe needs to hear it. And it's not mine, it's someone else's. But that opportunity for public engagement needs to be updated. Because cabinet submission box checking and town halls where moms with kids can't get to, because you take 2 hours of your workday to sit there, and you don't have childcare necessarily, that doesn't work. That's 20th century, that doesn't work. But the real opportunity to help expect a new generation of policymakers to think about these topics differently, to make sure that the unique needs of women in city building is part of their DNA. And so I hope I've shared a few different examples of ways that we'll see even more women leading the charge in cities in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sivan. And Linda, would you like to join our other women? Maybe we'll just pull a seat up there for Linda. Because now it is your turn. It is your turn to talk, and we have a couple of mics that'll travel around. What I propose is that we'll take 3 or 4 comments or questions from the audience, and then we can go back to the panel and see if there's any responses or thoughts. And we might have a couple of rounds of that. So could we have someone to come take the mic to travel? Thanks, Maureen. Right in the back there. It's on, I think.
Hello?
Yes. Okay, so right there.
Hi. I want to do 2 things. One is I want to thank this lady who unfortunately seems to have shifted out, who came here with her young child, because a number of you have addressed the fact that people with children don't get involved in this kind of a meeting because they can't. So I just wanted to thank her, wherever she is. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit, just mention is you talked about, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, but the Good Shepherd lady. Catherine. Sorry. You talked about women becoming in social services and becoming underhoused. And I think one of the problems with that is that the whole social services network is not adaptive to the concept of women or people sharing. It's always been very prohibitive for people to share places, share accommodation in any way. And part of the aging in place is that it's so much healthier and better for us to have people around us. But that also works for people who aren't necessarily under social services. So this is a little bit of a plug here. But I have set up a Facebook page called Co-Ho-Ho, which is Co-Housing Hamilton, Ontario. And anyone who wants to get involved in the conversation, whether you have investment money or whether you don't have investment money, whether you're looking for some help from government-funded agencies, but I'm just trying to get that conversation going where we can share accommodation, whether you're young, old, poor, not poor, and that will make our lives not only better but safer, because you have people to go out and do things with. You have a built-in support system, and so anyhow, Co-Ho-Ho on Facebook.
Fantastic, thank you. Oh, right next to you in the white shirt. Right there, yeah.
I'm not exactly sure where this will go next. I love that it feels like an organic type of process that could go just about anywhere. So I want to add 2 cents worth of pot stirring, if I may. It's something that I picked up on in the comments from several of the panel members that really resonated with me, and it's this notion of, Nazia, I think it was you actually posed the question, how do we define public space? But when I think of placemaking, and certainly when I think of city building, I'm not thinking of limiting that to what I think most people think of as public space, which I think often is thought of as publicly paid for So public space becomes synonymous with public purse, and therefore becomes subject to the prescriptive, restrictive hoops and whatever's the checkboxes that dictate what happens in public space and how people use it. And I really want to encourage in whatever comes next, bucking that notion that that's what this women in the city concept is limited to. It's about community and about being together, aging together, supporting each other, respectfully checking in your canoe while my boat happily goes along, but not dictating or prescribing anything. So it's just an observation and I guess a wish that we open it up beyond what that public purse says we must do.
Oh, you got, yeah, this. We're making Maureen get her stretches.
I'm making her run. I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm terrible at this. But I felt compelled. First of all, I want to say thank you for your comments. I did text, her name is Laura, and let her know that she was thanked, and she thanks back. I come from a place, my name is Milan, I'm the Director of Building Services at the YWCA in Hamilton. We come from a place where transitional living, regardless of funding models, is a priority. We also are in the process of developing space that will hopefully help serve women. And was it a week ago or 2 weeks ago, there was a really great conference called City Age that came to town. And there were a lot of policymakers and decision makers that sat on panels and discussed how in their cities, outside of here, but other mid-sized cities, they were developing zoning policies that were helpful and open to community building. And while we were going through a zoning process and we're so caught up in trying to catch up from the whole amalgamation story, I was thinking, wow, if we had these open zoning policies, our life would be so much easier. So my question to the panel, and I'm not sure exactly who can discuss it, but is how do we move from where we are now in these changes that are passing as we speak with regards to zoning in Hamilton? How do we move from this to something that will move towards community building and multi-use space and serving the community, whether it be for women, which is what the lens that we're looking through now, but just looking at community building in general, gendered and non-gendered.
Great, thank you. And we can have one more comment or question, yeah, over here in the second row. And then we'll go back to our panelists and see what they have to say.
Hi, I'd like to say thank you all for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. My name is Anna, and I don't necessarily have a specific question, but one that will hopefully encourage and inspire us all who are here today. And I would like to get a little bit of advice of what we should do after, if there's any opportunities that you might have specifically in your organizations that'll help individuals here in this room to kind of get that push forward. So that is my question. What is advice, wisdom, opportunities that you may have for us in the room? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Why don't we start with Linda, if Linda has any thoughts to share, and also because she hasn't really had a chance to say anything about what the panelists had to say. So we'll pass it along there, and if you want to pass, feel free to do so, but.
Thank you. I just want to say something briefly about how do you move from zoning to community. And I think the important point is that, zoning isn't a technical exercise. It's inherently political. And it's recognizing the politics of planning, which is often about, those who have the most getting more and those who have the least getting less. It's a form of indirect taxation, in fact. So to me, it's about working with the understanding of politics. I I don't know if you want to say something from Civic Action. I was really taken by the point when you said you couldn't be partisan. And for me, you have to be partisan because, you know, it's one thing about electing women, but if you're electing people like Theresa May or Margaret Thatcher, you know, they're not going to do anything for women. They're not interested, right? So to me, it's about starting with the most marginalized groups in society, because that to me means recognizing difference and working across difference. I prefer to think of difference as like relational connectedness, because that's what it's about. Difference isn't about sorting people into different groups, it's about recognizing the connectedness between us. And that means we have to absolutely start with the most marginalized, the most oppressed, and put them at the beginning, at the very center of zoning and of understanding that it's all political.
I'm not sure who I'm responding to, but what I'm thinking about is this notion of building community and all the technicalities around that, and your comment about what's next. And in the age of social media, I think the kinds of elect more women and status of women and different organizations that are going on, there's lots of opportunities to engage. But I think that building community, especially building community where women has voice, really requires that we look at all those intersecting social locations and we put down our phones and we go out into our communities and we actually talk to people who don't look like us and sound like us necessarily, and we get to know them on a personal level and we build actual communities instead of sitting about and idealizing about what a lovely inclusive community would look like. And I think that many of us have these quite lofty ideals about what community, how to build community, but I'm not sure that we're taking the step of actually striking up a conversation and taking risks. We are increasingly isolated and alienated.
And for me, I think it's one thing to invite people and include them in your activities, but it's another thing to, I think what we should be talking about is sharing the power within, whether it's at a very large level, at a very small level. So within our capacity, whether we are working at a very like small organization to a big organization, it's all about recognizing our privilege and sharing the power with people that we serve.
I think along the same lines, and I think it's, again, it's about being inclusive, not exclusive. And you know, sometimes, I don't mean to offend, but a lot of times sitting across the table is that white privilege. And so sometimes it's about checking your ego at the door and coming down to that level and being able to have those honest conversations. And you know, if you don't know, you don't know, so plead the ignorance and find out, because it only makes it an easier path if you have the knowledge of knowing where you need to go. So I think it's having that inclusivity and looking, what is your community made up of? And so who's sitting around that table within your community?
I think with respect to the zoning question in particular, I don't think, and if you want to change the idea of, I mean, I loved your perspective of it's a political process and it's about inclusion and exclusion. And I think the thing about zoning is governments and bureaucrats who make zoning changes and who look at those, and planners who look at those rules and process them through, are not the people who are going to make creative change in those rules and laws. So what you have to do is you have to challenge them by creating that new model. And I use an example from Peterborough of a fantastic affordable housing project that started there called The Mount at a former convent. And again, at City Age, we did an event during that event a few weeks ago, and the executive director from The Mount was here to present about what they're doing. And it is, go online and look at it. And it was led by their poverty network in Peterborough that led to finding solutions There were political goals and priorities around affordable housing, but no plan in how to meet that. And so there was a group of, as she called them, excuse my language, crazy-ass dreamers, who were the ones who fought and were diligent and pushed and pushed and pushed. And they have built this fantastic facility. They are now online with 43 affordable housing units of different scales and sizes, a large food share, food security program, an arts cultural hub, as well as other social services within this massive space. It's one example, and there was a lot of community support, but it required them to push to effect the change to allow them to do what they needed to do. So I would say that on the zoning. It's never going to change in government. It's going to be forced from the outside. And in mid-sized cities, and in a city like Hamilton, we're really good at pushing from the outside. So that's a good thing.
I think definitely on this note, what I'm thinking of are the 2018 municipal elections coming up in October. And I know I'm here tonight because I've been on the doors with Mary Louise and Maureen Wilson, knocking doors for various causes. And over the past few years, since I've gotten involved in various campaigns in Hamilton, I've seen, you know, a movement building of people we're hungry for community and we want to see change. And I think it's been a very valid point, and it's one that reflects my own experience, that women, we do amazing work in the neighborhoods and sort of behind the scenes, but don't run for office. And I think there's very good reasons for that. You know, there's cultural problems, there's work-life balance. You know, I can understand why we don't want to get involved. But I can say, based on my own experience, our experience in the neighborhoods and doing this organizing with our neighbors, with our friends, and getting out in a mid-sized city like Hamilton, this can translate to political power. It's much more accessible here. You can win an election with $30,000 rather than hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I know, watched people mobilize over transit, and there's been grumblings, you know, dissatisfaction. Let's get some good people in 2018. And so if you want to ask what you can do, I say let's build that movement and get some of the fabulous women, you know, here, and then we will support them and make it happen. Thanks.
Did you want to say something, Zoe?
One topic that hasn't come up yet is just the role of the media, right? So the ability to, when you think about some of those movements, those moments that have galvanized civil society across the board to act, remember the body of that 3-year-old boy who washed up on the shore. Remember, all of us have seen that image in our memory. We saw action spring, and maybe we were going to see that anyway, but I don't know that we were to that degree of empathy and compassion and speed. And so the role of the media in telling the stories of that need to be told, in being able to take data and make it come alive to a different audience. You know, I have a very talented set of colleagues back at Civic Action, and one of my colleagues, Laura, she did her public policy degree, master's degree, and she said one of her professors gave them this tip. I thought this was genius. He said, how many of you millennials, how many of you subscribe to newspapers at home? And like, nobody did, right? On the iPad and stuff, and they said, so you need to get the Globe and Mail, and you need to get the, in this case, Toronto Star, because the people that you want to influence get their news delivered to their front doors, and they turn the pages, and what they take in is in front of them, right, over the morning coffee. And that stayed with me, because the impact of social media allows us to just sort of scroll our way to familiar. And the benefit of the media to tell stories we may not have thought about, to put faces to data that only appears like a number, and allows us to broaden take our blinders off in terms of what we care about, is so powerful. And any one of you, your question, what can we do? Anything that really gets you agitated, that has a good angle, some reporter is kind of interested in. And they've stripped down the newsrooms anyway, so they're looking for great stories always. But start with that, like let's go back to the basics every once in a while, and a good story sells.
fantastic interventions. Does anybody else in the audience want to add something to this conversation? Okay, right over here.
Oh, I've got the.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, and the thing about the Globe and Mail, unlike social media, is that they have the resources to go in and find out about, let's see, a woman who killed people, or somebody who, oh gosh, I'm just trying to think about all of the things that the Globe and Mail has done, but they have resources to do investigative reporting that 140 characters can't do. And so that's what I am so proud about the Globe and Mail, which I read every day, you know, newspaper. And I think that's what social media can't do because they don't have the attention span.
Anyone else? Thank you, thank you. Anyone else? Oh, okay, a couple of, here, who are making our.
Oh, no, I don't mind.
You get to sit on the throne.
Thanks, everyone. My name's Erin, and this has been really fascinating. I wanted to just mention one thing that I think might be missing from this conversation, and that is the amount of energy that is required for women to participate in conversations like this. You know, I grew up like Savon's girls. I grew up in a household where it was completely possible, as far as I was aware, for me to grow up and be whatever I wanted. And then, you know, over the years, I've popped out of that bubble of ideology or of idealism and realized that it's exhausting to have an opinion. It's exhausting to be engaged. And you know, and I wonder. I've never lived as a man, so I don't know if that sort of cycle of doubt or cycle of being your own devil's advocate affects men in the same way. But I certainly feel anytime I engage in a conversation drained afterwards, and I wonder to what degree that has an impact on our ability to be engaged in the public sphere. And I think that that is why we're so good at being engaged at a community level, because there's such support around you. There's a group of people all on the same level doing the same work. And in public office, you're always on display and you're always being criticized. So my perception is that it's not as effective to be in the public office because I'm not working with other people in the same way. So I don't know, like, I guess I just wanted to add that because I think it's wonderful to talk about these sorts of things, but the actual action doesn't seem to happen as much as we talk about it, at least as far as public office. But I don't know.
Thank you. I really appreciate that intervention, actually. So we have I think we have one more comment two more comments? So we have this sister here, yes.
Oh, thank you. I'm so honored to be among this forum. I'm an architect by profession. What I feel like missing the comment, what can go from here, is a gap is that if we look at the city as a man-made and literally man-made city that have been crafted and shaped by hands of engineers, physical planners, architects, contractors who are predominantly men, then I think one of the gaps that can be filled through putting girls in disciplines that can feed these disciplines on the workforce. I think we should link that with academia, and we should not put academia as an ivory tower where people just get certificates and then when they go down the road, they are not there to whatever they have learned as math and science and engineering and maybe construction, and they can't apply it and they cannot bring their views to actually on the ground. and to participate in shaping the city as much as being there in decision-making in terms of politics and maybe push groups and lobbies and things like that, but actually sitting on the drawing board or now in front of the screen and shaping, shaping and crafting how the city look like and the physical space where we are visualizing it, where we are living there in those public spaces, on those houses, in those tiny rooms, where we are nurturing our kids, where we are taking care of our elderly, and how we live and experience that space. We need to be there to shape that space. I think that's what's missing in this work. Thank you so much.
I think there was one more comment on my right, one more way over on the right, and then I'll call Maureen up to wrap things up.
As we're having this conversation, women in the city and adding this gender lens to our work and to our role here, there's a couple of things that I wanted to have us self-reflect on, even in this room. When we think about women in the city, and when we bring in intersectionality, and when we talk about marginalized women and marginalized experiences and marginalized voices, even looking in this room today, seeing how pretty homogenous this room is, and how that is just very in contrast to the things that especially the panel has been talking about, and I think that we've been all talking about and thinking about. So when we talk about action, we talk about organizing. How do we organize? How do we move forward? I think when someone on the panel said, share the power, Nazi, I think that was you. Sharing the power, sharing the space. So it's more than just having conversations, it's more than just organizing, but how are you organizing? Who is included in your organizing team? Who is your end goal, and who's there with you along the process? And have those relationships been built? You know, talking about this kind of work makes people really uncomfortable. And Erin, you mentioned that having these opinions or having these discussions, sometimes it's exhausting. Having those conversations with men, sometimes, yes, very exhausting. But as a racialized person, having conversations with white folks, that in itself is very exhausting. And I'm asked the question all the time. I mean, I work at the Social Planning and Research Council, so I'm connected with the community in many different ways, and I'm always asked, how do we include, I'm doing this at an event, and how do I include people of color? How do I include more intersectionality in this? And I think that's the wrong question. Like, the event has already been planned, and it's already been advertised, and it's already been marketed, and now the question comes at the end, and I think that's terrible planning, actually. It needs to come way back to the forefront. Why are you even doing this? Who is it being catered to, and how critical is the process in thinking about who do you want to market this to? And sometimes I pose a question, if you do hold an event, when you do gather space, and if everyone that showed up was a person of color, how would you feel as a white person facilitating and organizing an event? Would you feel like, oh, maybe we need to cancel and get more white folks involved in the process? Or maybe if everyone, just folks living some type of marginalized experience, if those folks just showed up to the room, would that create some discomfort? And I think we need to start thinking about that, our own discomforts and our own unconscious biases, I guess, before we even start to reach out to community and build those relationships to then organize and to create some massive change, or to create community around those concepts. That's what I wanted to share.
Thank you. So I'm going to call Maureen Wilson to the front, and she is going to put a nice bow on this event. But I will say that if you are interested in more of what the Useful Knowledge Society does, you should, if you don't already, follow them on Facebook, follow them on Twitter, as those are the main free spaces, for good or ill, that we have to communicate with each other. And those are spaces where at least we can begin to talk, continue to have conversations about the things that we really value. I am very appreciative of all of the interventions that people in the front and people in the audience made tonight. I think it's really important to say uncomfortable things because I think that it's only through those kinds of tensions that we actually work through towards building the kind of city that everyone feels included in. So the path may be difficult, but the result is worthwhile. So thanks, and Maureen, please join me.